And just to clarify, so Queens and Prophets is in the title of the book. What relationship are you trying to imply here between the monarch or the noblewoman and the prophet?
I just happened to stumble across, the role of women in a particular type of woman who is, comes from a wealthy, noble background and tends to rule. Who is the last Near Eastern pretender to the Roman throne? It's a
Hmm.
woman.
Right.
Who was the first historical Arab Christian monarch in Arabia? It's a woman. Who was the first Muslim on record in the world? It's a woman.
So,
Female power, female divinity. She really shaped Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. Without Khadijah, there is no Muhammad. Amazing women never cease, even
right.
until today.
Mhm.
And that story is just fascinating.
So, hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Book Café Podcast. I'm your host Omar Nizam, and in today's episode, we will be talking about the book entitled Queens and Prophets: How Arabian Noblewomen and Holy Men Shaped Paganism, Christianity, and Islam. And my conversation partner for this episode is somebody who needs absolutely no introduction. For those of you who have been with the show for a while now, will instantly recognize Professor Dr. Emran El-Badawi from episode 11, where we spoke about his other book, The Quran and the Aramaic Gospel Traditions. So definitely do check out that episode after you've watched or listened to this episode. But as far as today goes, let me first do my due diligence by welcoming back Professor Dr. Emran El-Badawi. Hi, Imran. Welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Omar, and thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure.
Hmm. Absolutely. It's really great to see you. So, Imran, let me just start off with the most important question for today. Apni kemon achen?
Um, Baloachi.
Oh, wonderful. So
I
I'm
said that
really,
right.
yes, you got that absolutely right. So I knew it was just a matter of time before you added Bengali to the repertoire of languages that you're so accustomed to. And yeah, so the last time we spoke was in, by my count, March 2023, and at the time you were still teaching at the University of Houston. Please tell us what's changed since then.
Sure. So, in 2023, I think, my last year as department chair
Mhm.
of modern and classical languages at the University of Houston, where I have fond memories, lots of great colleagues and friends. And since then, early 2024, I transitioned to a new role of Dean of the College of Liberal and Fine Arts
Mhm.
at Tarleton State University. So that's part of the Texas A&M system. The Texas ecosystem, there's a lot of rivalries between universities. So I'm now moved to a rival university. I'm an administrator, so I'm not teaching. I
Mhm.
research really whenever there's time, which there never is. And
Mhm.
so most of my time is spent working with people and with budgets and going to events. And so that's why I'm glad we managed to squeeze this interview in,
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
I'm in between things. But so there's been a lot of change.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and thank you so much for making the time to speak to us today, because I know exactly how busy you've been. So, Imran, just coming back to our discussion for today. So, Queens and Prophets. First, let me just start off by saying that I'd really like to congratulate you, first and foremost, for writing a book about this, which puts a spotlight on the forgotten women of pre-Islamic Arabia, or pagan Arabia or Christian Arabia. But I am getting a bit ahead of myself. So first, let me just ask, why now? I mean, it wasn't this some. I would have assumed that this was something that perhaps other academics would have also spoken about or written about in the years gone by. But is this really the first book of its kind? Maybe we can just start from there. Yeah.
Well, every academic and artist and author wants to feel that they are sort of one of a kind and first.
Hmm.
And in all truth, every original product is new. It's an original contribution. But I also don't want to give myself too much credit. It's really kind of an accident of, as a researcher, you ask questions and then you also change your mind based on the evidence that you find, experiences that you have, and also corrections to your own assumptions. So all of those things were happening to me, maybe close to the pandemic, slightly before. I was doing lots of research looking especially at holy men in Arabia, interested in looking at the transition, how does it transition from majority pagan to majority, a monotheistic, the things that me and my colleagues are working on, There's lots of scholarship again. Gabriel Reynolds, who you have on the show, of course,
Mhm.
Ilka Lindstedt, others. So I was doing that, and I just happened to stumble across, the role of women in a particular type of woman who is, comes from a wealthy, noble background and tends to rule. And I'm like, oh well, no one's sort of put these stories together. So on a personal level, that's what happened with me is I had to kind of pivot. I
Mhm.
had to sort of pause my work on looking at the men so I could focus more on the women.
Mhm.
And on a personal level, that's what happened. I have described it kind of as an happy accident and
Mhm.
stumbling across really great women, sort of tripping over these giants.
Right.
Um, One thing that happens within higher education, pardon me, one thing that happens within research and scholarship, especially within, history and language, religion, culture, it's like other areas, maybe even in the STEM fields, where there's so much focus on something.
Mhm. Yeah.
So it's almost like mining. When you mine something, you're getting more and more of the same thing over and over again. So our knowledge, our deepening knowledge of, the s- s- sort of scriptural discussions between scriptures, or delving into Byzantine history, or looking at, uh, even recent developments within Syriac Christian literature, that we're going really, really deep and getting really, really, I think, good. But things fall through the cracks, and I'm like, okay, 50% of the population is missing from
Mhm.
all of this. And
Exactly.
I also felt in my mind, like, that's not right. We're not doing the right job as scholars and as researchers. If we're mining, we're not miners. We're supposed to actually, try and cover some territory. And one last thing I will add is that
Mhm.
I'm convinced that the role of women, female power, female divinity, their agency when it comes to certain public life, marriage, etc., is actually the missing link, or one very important missing link between looking at the sort of pagan past of Arabia and the Near East and its Abrahamic sort of, future at the time. So I'll stop there. That's
Mhm.
it. It's
Yeah.
also it's so important that I consider it a missing link.
Right. So, in other words, it was very serendipitous. And yeah, I think that the world is all the more, better for you having written this book, because I know that from my interactions with you over the years that you are a feminist, and my wife and I are both staunch feminists. And so it came as a very pleasant surprise when I read the book that, finally we have something that we can call our own. And yes, so we definitely have to get into the weeds as well, because there's so many interesting stories about these women that we had no knowledge of. And after having read about their, life histories, it really does make us think as to how they were so blatantly erased. But just before we jump ahead, in the book you mentioned that you were bemoaning the paucity of sources because they're so scant. But by my count, the book is in excess of 300 pages. So at the end of it all, did you find that the sources were actually very scant, or were you able to scrape up enough or mine enough of these stories to be able to put together the book? So tell us about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, and I will reveal to you now. I do lots of these podcasts. I'll reveal to you sort of an answer I haven't shared with anyone else.
Hmm.
Um, I had lunch one day with Robert Hoyland in
Hmm.
New York City. And Robert Hoyland is,
Right.
he's the author of many works
Hmm.
pertaining to Arabia and the Near East. I consider him one of my shuyukh. He's a teacher of mine. I've been reading his stuff since I was in grad school. And I remember presenting to him this idea. I'm like, I want to write this big book. I didn't have an idea of a trilogy at the time. I just said one book
Hmm.
on, the role of especially, female agency and women in pre-Islamic Arabia. And he posed to me, this is sort of, a really important intellect and a storied academic, prolific scholar. And he said, I don't think you have enough material. He goes, I don't think you have enough evidence to even produce a book.
Hmm.
And I never told anyone about this story, but I took that as a personal challenge. I said,
Hmm.
"You have no idea how much notes I have on my computer right now, right?" And so I guess the answer is it's a little bit complicated. On the one hand, we have folks like Ahmed Jalad who travel every summer, and he's always digging up. Again, but what do you produce? You produce such small texts. Yes, they're
Hmm.
pregnant with meaning, but they're so meager. So that's on the one hand, yes, there's very little documentary evidence. On the other hand, there's an avalanche of literary sources in Arabic and Syriac, Greek, right? To some extent, later on, of course, you have Ethiopic, Persian, right? Coptic. So the good scholar has to balance reading almost literally, so to speak, the scratches on the rocks, which come from, ancient times, with an imaginative rereading, a sort of re-looking at the literary sources, and you put those two together, and actually there's quite a lot of material. And I would say that the problem again with maybe some of my colleagues and even some folks in the field is they just feel like it's a lost case. Oh, the Jahiliyyah, right? The pre-Islamic Arabia is this big black hole, nothing happened there. And we have, we suspect some things here and there. No, there's actually a lot more there than we anticipated. And the more we dig up sources from the ground and we reread the literary sources, we start to discover that women actually were quite active. And as I make the case in the book, they've actually been written out. So it's actually an effort to actually remove them from history.
Right.
So all of these things together made this project so big. There's so much to say, and we just haven't been looking, and hopefully now we are.
Indeed. So who am I kidding? It's not just 300 pages. This is the first book of an ongoing trilogy, and your second book, Female Divinity in the Quran, also goes up to about 250 pages. I'm sure Professor Hoyland must have regretted saying what he did to you before you started on this. So yeah.
And just to clarify, he is a great advocate and hero. He was the first one and he supported my work throughout with the publisher. So I'm indebted to him.
Okay, fantastic. So coming to the main characters of the book, Emran, can you please tell us how you came? So the main characters of the book, I found it to be extremely interesting. But how did you select who was going to make it into the book and whose story was going to maybe take a back seat? It must not have been easy, given that now you've mentioned that there was in fact a lot of resources to draw upon. So tell us about that. How did you pick your main characters? Yeah.
Yes. So for Queens and Prophets, the book is divided into three parts. And the first part really looks at just a long history of queenship in North Arabia. Regents, heads of state, chieftains, all of whom are women. One is Zenobia, in Arabic, Az-Zabba, right? Or Zenobia. And then the second one is Mavia or Mavia of Tanukh. Much less known character. Not a lot of people know about her. And the third one, of course, is Khadeejah bint Khuwaylid of Mecca. Khadeejah, that is the Prophet Muhammad's first wife. You're talking about, in the case of Zenobia, who was the last Near Eastern pretender to the Roman throne? It's a woman.
Right.
Who was the first historical Arab Christian monarch in Arabia? It's a woman. Who was the first Muslim on record in the world? It's a woman. So all these things sort of just come together. You have evidence. You have, wow, bam, these are really important world historical figures. And then you string together the stories of how all these three women transitioned the entire sort of Near East through Arabia, right? From a kind of multifaceted, highly complex interreligious, multicultural context to a more Abrahamic, set of traditions. And that story is just fascinating. So I think that I just dedicated a lot of time, but they were so fascinating. There was so much material that the story ended up really telling itself, and they're all connected. And after that, I look at, the men that kind of took over, whether we're talking about Roman emperors or or Persian shahs, and of course the Arab caliphs, and that just really in my opinion, squashing female rule and agency in the public sphere to such a large extent. There still are luminaries, and again, some of them are going to come out in the third book. In the early Islamic period. Again, there's amazing women never cease, even until today. Okay, so that was a prolonged.
No worries. And just to clarify, so Queens and Prophets is in the title of the book. What relationship are you trying to imply here between the monarch or the noblewoman and the prophet? So tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So what I'm arguing in the book is that these women, who I've named already, exercise their power,
Mhm.
especially their power to sort of rule, conduct trade, wars, etc., as monarchs, as the head of state. But the way they ruled in some cases, and maybe other historians can look more into this, I would say is quite different than the way men would rule. And what I'm arguing is that there was a lot of delegation to a kind of wingman, a kind of right-hand
Mhm.
man. So in the case
Right.
of Zenobia, Paul of Samosata, who is, a famous heretic.
Mhm.
Again, these phrases, which again, I sort of undermine, question in the book itself. He is a holy man who Zenobia entrusts with various things. Now, she has also a council of men who, again, if we get into it's fascinating how she rules,
Mhm.
and how her prototype is taken by other women later on, including the Queen of Sheba. If you want, we can talk about that
Yeah.
later.
Mhm.
But then even the second one, Mavia, right, who is really sort of this rugged chief. She is a warrior.
Mhm.
She's someone who she's out there to fight, and she fought the Romans and beat them every time. She delegated also the advocacy of the Arab peoples that she ruled to a Moses of Sinai, and
Mhm.
not that Moses that people know from the Bible, a
Mhm.
different Moses.
It's a different one. Yeah.
And he is really the one who converted the masses to Christianity.
Mhm.
There's some other folks again, fourth, fifth century, where that's really the tipping point where Arabia starts to flip from towards Christianity. And then, of course, in the case of Khadijah, one argument I've made, it makes some people uncomfortable, but I don't think it
Mhm.
should,
Yeah.
which is that, she really shaped Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam.
Mhm.
It's not the other way around.
Yeah. 100%.
And I think that is really important. And people, if you go deep into the book, I mean, it's without Khadijah, there is no Muhammad.
Mhm.
And I mean, all the way down to the level of religion and God and seeing the world in what would later on become sort of an Islamic worldview. That's
Mhm.
because of Khadijah. So,
Yeah, absolutely. So without Khadija, there is no Muhammad. I think that's really poetically said. And I was going to touch upon Khadija sometime later on during this episode, but since you've already brought her up, let's stick with her for a little bit. So you make an argument in the book that it was in fact Khadija who was supporting the Prophet Muhammad both financially as well as a protector. And later on in the sources, her role was usurped or perhaps downplayed, and Abu Talib's role was elevated. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about why you feel that this was the case and why we have to be a bit sus when it comes to the tradition. Yeah.
oh yeah, I mean, I go into this quite a bit in the book, but one argument that I make is that, you have a world transforming individual, right? Muhammad the Prophet. And he's not alone. In order to succeed in this world, he needed support. And, it was a difficult time to speak to God, quite frankly. And he had two allies early in his life. One is his uncle Abu Talib, and the second one, or the other one, is his wife Khadijah. And I'm arguing every step of the way that it's his wife,
Hmm.
an older, wealthy woman, for so many reasons that even that we get from just the literature itself, right? We don't
Yeah.
have any epigraphic evidence of Khadijah. It's all from the
Mm.
sources later on. She was the one who protected him, sort of on the day to day.
Hmm.
She was the one who was his best friend for the longest period of his entire life. She was the one who, where they had where she and Muhammad had a healthy monogamous marriage,
Hmm.
and that's not the case afterwards, right? Where things become a little bit more unclear. And she's the one, again, her family, including basically the Abd al-Uzza, Fakhr Abd al-Uzza, right? They are the ones who um, bring, I argue, the world of, they represent the Hanif and Christian world in Mecca during that time, if we read the sources, if we believe the sources.
Hmm.
So I'm qualifying what I'm saying. And also, if we read the sources, what's the alternative? I mean, you look at Abu Talib, who's his uncle. He's poor,
Hmm.
impatient. He's like, you know what? I can't pay you anymore. Why don't you go work for that wealthy woman out there? And he's frustrated because, his nephew is entering this world where Hanifism and Christianity and now Islam is taking over his worldview, and is really rather kind of absent. And the background of the Abd Manaf, Fakht Abd Manaf, right? No, pardon me. Yes, I think so. That side of the family, Muhammad's family, basically is all pagan. And I mean pagan, like, like old-fashioned pagan. Like they don't, they're not into, trying to reconcile until later on. If you put these things together, it's like, this is like a no-brainer. Why? You have a woman who was standing by her man, who was actually shaping her man, and then you have an uncle who is sort of an old, a grumbling old man, God love him, but who didn't play a role day to day. And yet the tradition plays up Abu Talib, and there's all this poetry about him passing, and he was like the protector. He was none of these things, right? So we have to read the sources very critically when it comes to assessing Muhammad's relationship with, the sort of yin and yang of his life, the people who got him through. Even if we take Waraq ibn Nawfal, it's not a historical name, but it's probably a historical character that comes from Khadijah's side. All the good monotheistic stuff comes from Khadijah, and all the stubborn, antagonistic, masculine stuff comes from Abu Talib's side. And Abu Talib was, again, he was one of his advocates, but he was nowhere near as important as Khadijah. And I think that his role has been sort of distorted towards the positive. I would say there's all sorts of biases in there when it comes to either gender or even clan and tribal affiliations that should be corrected.
Right. And just in that answer, Imran, there's a couple of tangential questions that popped in mind, and let's go through a couple of them. So with regards to Khadeejah and her own background, do scholars speculate that perhaps she did come from a Christian background? And given the fact that when the Prophet Muhammad got his first call to prophethood, she did take him to see Waraq ibn Nawfal, who was, as per the sources, if we believe them, a committed Christian.
So, yeah, I'm not the first person to publish about the Christian background of Khadijah. There are, I think Joseph Azzi, there are other folks, Khalil Abdul Karim, especially in Arabic. There's, people said some of the things that I've said and got completely trampled in line. Nobody cared.
Yeah.
It shows you the sheer power of tradition and lack of critical thinking. That I am not the first person to say these things, and when people hear it, they're kind of startled or they ignore it entirely. So other people have written to varying degrees about the Christian background of Khadijah, and to what extent did this shape Muhammad's worldview, and we don't know for sure. So again, I'm just going to make an argument. Other people make an argument, and لكل مجتهد نصيب. Every mujtahid can get his or her reward. I may be right, I may be wrong, but it's there. That's what the sources say, and I go again very deep in the book in terms of how Muhammad got married and Khadijah's role, paying the dowry. First of all, asking for his hand in marriage, paying the dowry, everything. The entire marriage story between Muhammad and Khadijah and Muhammad contravenes Islamic tradition like 100%. And people are okay with it. If they're okay with it, that's fine. I'm just going to tell you what our tradition says. You can do something else, and and I will think critically about it. So I hope others do as well.
Yeah.
But I'm not the only one. And at the same time, I'm cognizant that I don't want to go too far. There's no evidence that Khadijah herself personally was Christian. There is literary evidence coming later that she came from a Christian background. Her blood relatives were either Christian or Hanif. So there's a monotheistic background there. And that much I think we can say tentatively. But people should welcome it. And I put on my Muslim hat. I think believers should welcome a more critical understanding. It doesn't affect the story in any negative way.
Of course, yeah. And if I can just jump in and say one more thing. The Prophet's wife, Maria, she was Coptic Christian, albeit that he had a relationship with her way down the line into his prophethood. But it's not controversial to call Maria a Coptic Christian, but somehow Khadeejah calling her a Christian or giving the opinion that she had a Christian background is controversial. So do you find that to be a little hypocritical when it
Yeah,
comes from the
you
theology?
bring a good point. Maria al-Qibtiyya, right? I mean, again, to what extent do we believe all these stories? Again, the list of women in the sources that Muhammad should have, the Prophet Muhammad, either had a marriage with, was sort of betrothed to, had a written contract that was never even, realized. That list is long. And again, the sources try to show, how the Prophet was making alliances and, on how other tribes should have, connected to the Prophet. It's a mark of honor. So you got to be critical there as well. But yeah, I mean, it's just, there's nothing wrong with that. You know what I mean?
Of course. And you also mentioned something else in your answer, Imran. It's about the monogamous relationship between Khadijah and the Prophet Muhammad. So just out of curiosity and for the sake of our viewers and listeners, and in fact, it's also something I'm very curious about. What was what was it like when it came to relationships in pre-Islamic Arabia? Was polygamy very prevalent as per the sources that you've come across? And I'll tell you where I'm going with this. It seems as though that, okay, so let me just make sure I get the definitions right. So polygyny is when a husband has multiple wives, and polyandry is when a wife has multiple husbands. After the Quranic revelation, it seems that polygyny was preferred over polyandry. And I was just wondering if the reduction in female power may have been one of the reasons behind this particular Quranic edict. So I'll let you run with that. Yeah.
Okay, sure. And I think minor correction. Let me just, so polygyny, ending with Gyny, is male or female having multiple partners.
Okay.
Polygamy is male with multiple female partners. Polyandry is woman with multiple
Multiple
male.
husbands. Right. Okay. I stand corrected. Yeah.
No, no worries. So I mean,
Yeah.
so now the real answer. I mean, this is the third book, right? This is the book that I have sitting now, in my notes. Um, I it's something I have to argue, and the argument that I'm making, and it's based on really scanty sources, and so I'm making, I'm sort of trying to frame it in a way that doesn't come out wrong, like with a range. And the range that I'm proposing, looking at number one, looking at the Quran, number two, looking at a couple of epigraphic sources, and three, of course, this avalanche of literary sources all around us. And what I argue is that in pre-Islamic Arabia, women and men could and did have multiple partners. And now, to what extent women do this, I don't know, right? I mean, I'd have to argue and extrapolate, and I know that some people would completely reject outright. But the original contribution that I'm making in that regard is that the argument that I'm making is that women and men had multiple partners simply based on its viability, economic means. So if you have the sheikh of the qabila of Quraysh, Kinda, whatever it is, they have multiple wives. Nobody cares. That's just the norm. I'm arguing that that's also possible on the female side. And one case again is Mavia, and there are a couple of other cases where you have women who are named, probably priestesses, and their names are matrilineal. Their name is daughter,
Right.
daughter of the mother, daughter of the grandmother, etc. And so you got to piece these things together and at least open the door that yes, women in pre-Islamic Arabia, depending on which context, depending on what time, could have multiple male partners. And it has to do with, I would say, socioeconomic issues. Some of it is just, can you afford to have multiple partners? The other thing is, what's your status? One thing that's really, really important to argue in all three of the books is the role of the priestess. You have the kahin and the kahina. And you just find them in the sources. And also, the different Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah, Khalid ibn Walid, these people who go out and sort of conquer Arabia. Some of what they do is they conquest means, killing people and destroying things. Even though, anyway, that deserves its own sort of episode by itself. But they also eliminate the priests and priestesses. That is critical in the demotion of women in general, I would say, their
Mm-hmm.
status,
Mm-hmm.
that there's no longer a priestess there because the priestess facilitated the relationship, obviously, between the human and the divine, but also between male and female, and it made it possible for women to have more than one male partner. Let me end with this and say that within the Quran, you find certainly within Surah An-Nisa, Surah number 4, and interspersed as well. I think was it Surah Al-Ahzab, I'm not sure, but there are a couple other, the Medinan surahs, which regulate the relationship with men and women. You still find in there, it says, the good women are the ones who are sort of, the good ones are the ones who are married but don't have boyfriends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Why is the Quran prohibiting these kinds of relationships for women in the Quran? Because before the Quran, that's what they used to do.
Mm.
You
That's a
you
good point.
could,
Yeah.
based on the Quran itself, you could be a married woman and have a boyfriend. So
Yeah.
now, so that's of course been eliminated, and I argue that that's been eliminated because, of course, within the Abrahamic traditions and the normative marital relations between male and women accommodate polygamy, but not
Mm-hmm.
polyandry. And I'll stop there.
And with that answer, I'm quite sure we must have just broken the internet. But let's move on to another character from the book. So the Queen of Sheba, I think she's one of the most well-known characters within the biblical and biblical and Quranic world. And as per my understanding, she probably lived about 1,000 years before Jesus. But and you also limit the fact that she hasn't been well attested to in the historical sources, but that's also true for David and Solomon and for all the characters from that time period. Wouldn't you say so? Yeah.
Yes. So the figure of the Queen of Sheba, or just Malikat Saba, Bilqis,
Hmm.
names were
Yeah.
she. Just to clarify, in the Quran, the only sort of unnamed woman ruler is, I mean, the only woman who rules is the Queen of Sheba, and she's unnamed.
Hmm.
Um, and that is a sort of, you can telescope the different um, um, stories and traditions that it goes through just to get to the Quran. And after the Quran, it goes even there are other traditions that build upon it. Um, I forget your question now.
No, so my question was that the Queen of Sheba, she is not well attested to in the historical sources, but
Oh,
that's also true for David and Solomon. But regardless of that, the point that I found to be very interesting in the book is that it's actually North Arabians who had female monarchs, but she's supposed to come from the south. So what's that all about?
yeah. So what I argue in there, and I'm not the first one as well.
Hmm.
Pardon me. What I argue is that the figure of the Queen of Sheba in its biblical form, whenever it was written, this is prior, of course, it's in the Hebrew Bible, so it's pretty early.
Hmm.
It's not based on a South Arabian woman monarch, but
Hmm.
on North Arabian. Because if you're whatever, the kingdom of Israel or Palestine or Judah, you're in the north, you're
Right.
far in the north.
Yeah.
And there are lots of Arabic speakers, Arabian related peoples in the north. And in the south, especially, in ancient times, that's not so well attested. I mean, again, that's, one can argue where did the Arabs come from and stuff like that, but I would say the north.
Hmm.
So, and I'm not the first one to say this, but this is a figure that has been put together by good storytellers based on queens in the north.
Hmm.
And in the south, the connections would probably have to do with, the Romans are the ones who really connect Arabia with itself. Whether it's Pliny or other sort of geographers, and they make Arabia all one big thing, based especially on trade and on seafaring. So the queen up in, potentially, east of the Jordan River, or, in the kingdom of Qidar, or whatever the ancient kingdom was at the time, was the queen of like all Arabia. But it's unlikely that she comes from the south. In my opinion, it's got to be the north.
Indeed. And, staying with the Queen of Sheba, I mean, her story in the Quran and perhaps even in the Bible as well, it never really sat well with me in the sense that it seems like it's not so much about a female monarch submitting herself to God, but rather it is the story of a female monarch submitting herself to another male monarch. So is that, I mean, and this is the kind of reading that I kind of started thinking more about after we had done an episode with Professor Dr. David Penchansky, who wrote a fabulous book called Solomon and the Ant, and he's also very well known to you. And he said during that episode that King Solomon was a complete jerk. So, you have to applaud the professor's humor. But do you feel that this is the correct interpretation that Dr. Penchansky has also put forth in his book, as well as I mean, I seem to be reading everything through that particular lens of gender. But how would you look at it, Imran? Please tell us about that.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating, and again, the conversation with you and Dr. Penchansky, it's just such a, it all comes together quite nicely. And again, it's something where, as believers reading a scripture, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, etc., I admonish everyone, really, I beseech you all. These are all flawed characters. The Quran even, and Gabriel has published about this, Reynolds, that the flawed nature again of prophets and so on and so forth in the Quran. At least he's presented that at conferences. But that's something we should take seriously. And even in Surah 27, the ants, right? Surah An-Naml, it also didn't sit well with me. I'm like, why is this guy so mean? Why does he want to, punish the hoopoe bird? Why is he so, laughing at the ants because they're worried that he's going to crush them with his army? I'm like, and then when he meets the queen, he's so terrible. And as I've said in other shows as well, it's even within the Quran, you have this rebuke, I would say, in the voice of a woman saying, "Inna al-muluk idha dakhalu al-ard afsaduha." Indeed, when the kings enter the land, they utterly ruin it. This is a woman, bewailing to the world. This is what men do to the world, that they ruin the world. And that's in the Quran. So I would say we can accept that, there are great leaders and King David and Solomon, et cetera, et cetera. I would say, in a more of an archetype, again, there's no archaeological or epigraphic evidence again of them. We can accept that we have heroes and that they're flawed, to say the least. And I may not, I may have my own opinions about these things, but that to me, especially Surah 27, if we give it some critical thinking, you could come up with very different conclusions than the Mufassirun do. But it's also about the role of women standing up for good governance and men ruining everything.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? And I think that the Hadith tradition takes it even further by saying, if I'm not mistaken, that a country or a kingdom ruled by a woman will never prosper. And it's I think it's quite miraculous that in Muslim majority countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, we still manage to elect women leaders despite all these this opposition from tradition. So yeah, kudos to all of the women who were elected to the premiership. By the way, which is something that we still haven't seen here in the United States, right? So we're still waiting for that first female president. So, but political dynasties aside, let me just ask another question, and this is with regards to pre-Islamic Arabia and Ibn Kalbi's Book of Idols. I'm not very familiar with the book, Emran. Would you be able to tell us just very briefly what Ibn Kalbi's Book of Idols is about and what exactly is mentioned there, and then we'll proceed along that line. Yeah,
it's an interesting book. It's a fascinating read. He introduces pre-Islamic Arabia, and he lists almost like biographies, a couple of dozen gods and goddesses, mainly centered around the Mecca, Hijaz area, but elsewhere in Arabia, going up to Sham and Yemen and other things like that, the Syria and Yemen. The book itself is interesting because there are some things in there which are useful. I would say probably accurate, but then there's a lot in there which is just lore, and it makes it seem similar to Ibn Ishaq and later on Ibn Hisham and Tabari and the really, really big names of Islamic tradition, that pre-Islamic Arabia was this ancient backwater where people were just sort of, praying to rocks and were sort of sexually promiscuous and, worshiping like mindless, barbarians. And I think that has the part of the reason for that is, I think some of that, by the way, is Jewish and Christian influence. That this is you've now religion is the light, and whatever came before is the darkness. So the term the Jahiliyyah, the period of ignorance, really stands out very, very powerfully in that book. That's one reason. The other reason is, I think by the time really of Ibn al-Kalbi's writing, a couple of centuries, 150, 200 years after what we call Sadr al-Islam, the nascent period of Islam, the early caliphates, and when the Quran is put together, people don't know anymore what pre-Islamic Arabia is. So when he's talking about, Hubal or Al-Lat, Manat, Uzza, he's talking about,
Sorry, let me just jump in here, Imran. And those are the three names that I was looking for: Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. These are pre-Islamic Arabian goddesses, deities that are mentioned in the book of Ibn al-Kalbi. But as far as I understand from our previous discussions, that post the year 500, there are no more pagan inscriptions that have been dug up. So what are these three names of the goddesses doing in the Quran in a milieu where there's not supposed to be any pagan gods at all? So tell us about that.
Okay. So that is much more complicated. I will finish the easier part and I'll get to the complicated part. I'll say that, within Ibn al-Kalbi's Kitab al-Asnam, he lists all these deities, and by the time he's writing it, it's centuries between him. I mean, if he's writing, let's just say 800, and the last time that people were at least writing down that they worshipped or they venerated these supreme deities or higher beings was 400. I mean, that's 400 years ago. Think about us right now and 400 years ago. If I had to write about 400 years, I have no idea. There was no recollection anymore. So the depth of knowledge and narrative history and mythology and the interconnectedness of these gods completely gone. So it's almost like just him, he's reading like, stickers, or, he didn't have firsthand knowledge. So now to jump to the Quran, what on earth, right, are these ancient names doing in the Quran? The Quran is a bewildering, beautiful text, right? If it's the year 600, 610, 632, 656 at the latest, right? Why are we seeing Al-Lat, Manat, Uzza? I mean, people have been converting to Christianity for over 200 years, 300 years at least. We shouldn't see anything like this anymore. Why are we seeing these pagan names? And on the one hand, in the Quran, the God or the speaker is addressing monotheistic audiences. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, ya ahl al-kitab. These phrases occur dozens of times. But then there's like this once or twice. I mean, it's once where it refers to the three goddesses in Surah 53. In Surah Nuh, it refers to the other five South Arabian deities. So I would argue that there is, again, the Quran is recollecting for polemical purposes. It is playing up Arabia's pagan past to sort of attack theologically. Oh, you're misbehaving. You Christians and Jews who are continuing to venerate these gods like angels or intermediaries. I think that's sort of what's happening. Again, some of this is still being molded based on scholarship and evidence, but it's people. There's no church of Al-Lat, Manat, Uzza. It doesn't.
Okay.
And some people argue, again, like you'll have folks, Aziz Al-Azma, who really do argue for the pagan reservation of
Right.
Mecca and Hijaz, that it's really a backwater. I'm not so sure if it's that extreme. So it's Hijaz especially, but Arabia is an interesting mix of sort of this Christian, layer over, that's overlaid a complex pagan past, and people are continuing to venerate the jinn and the angels and other people. So we're still developing this area of scholarship. So I don't have a final answer.
No worries. We'll take your answer as it is, and a lot of tangential questions that I wish I could take this in so many different directions. But let me just stick to the question that I did have. Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. So this is a tripartite formula, and this is something that seems very ubiquitous in the ancient world. So I listed a couple of more. So Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva from the Hindu tradition, Father, Son, Holy Ghost from the Christian tradition. In Islam, we have the Basmala, Allah, Rahman, and Rahim, and maybe the heterodox Quranic Trinity, Father, Mother, and Son. Maybe Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So what is up with the tripartite formula, and why is it so prevalent in the ancient world? So we need to have an understanding of that.
Yes, I think here we're going to the territory of the second book, which is female divinity in the Quran, which is okay. I'll answer. I mean, the tripartite nature. First of all, within the Quran, the tripartite structures in the Quran has been visited by uh, other colleagues. So I mean, I think Manfred Kropp and other German scholars have looked into this. I've looked into it before, and in the case of the second book, female divinity in the Quran, I go in depth into why this is the case, and I argue that all human beings, right, really within civilization, certainly within the ancient Near East and the late antique Near East, would access the divine in this tripartite manner, this tripartite formula. It doesn't matter if monotheistic, polytheistic, it doesn't matter, right? They're going to do it. So I go into depth over there, and your question is sort of like, why is it that human beings do this? And I'll read a little bit actually from page 111 in the second book. The origins of divine triads have been the subject of much examination and speculation by anthropologists. The range of conjecture postulates as their origin: one, the supremacy of the three stages of the sun to the human imagination; two, the agricultural cycle of life, death, and rebirth; three, the divine couple and child; and four, the triple goddesses originated in the three stages of the moon, and Trinitarian deities were frequently syncretic and heterogeneous in nature. So it's kind of a combination of, the celestial with the terrestrial, the agricultural with the sort of, the astral looking, and there's a very famous ancient triad of the sun, moon, and Venus in South Arabia, which is very famous, and it goes back again to the King Solomon. He was like, we found that there's this woman who is, worshiping the sun, moon, and etc. That's actually true. So I would
Yeah.
just say that this goes back into just, I think, part of
Okay.
our evolutionary history.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And now I remember that it was in the second book, but it's been about a year since I read it, so I totally forgotten about it. But can you tell us a bit more about the three goddesses, Imran, with regards to their presence in pre-Islamic Arabia? What kind of, I mean, do we have anything at all about who they were as perhaps human beings who later became deified? I think you also mentioned in the book that I think Al-Lat was the most attested of the three goddesses, but the other two perhaps not as much so. So perhaps you could tell us a bit more about that. Yeah.
Al-Lat is the most widely attested deity, male or female, in ancient Arabia. And her analog, her predecessor, so Ishtar or Inanna in the ancient Near East, originating in Mesopotamia, but really covering the ancient Near East, is the most widely attested deity, male or female, in the I would say the ancient Near East, but certainly in ancient Mesopotamia. That in and of itself deserves some pause. The fact that ancient people, whether it's Arabia or the Near Eastern context, were worshiping Al-Lat more than anyone else. Again, I know that, there's some argument to be made. Okay, this is attestation. This is not necessarily sort of cultic veneration. Fine. But it has to count for a whole lot, since we're obsessed with extrapolating information from text anyway. If we extrapolate, again, if we're not mining, but we're actually thinking critically, this has to mean something. Why is the veneration, or at least the recording of female deities, super important, and then it just disappears, right? It gets sort of wiped over. In the case of Al-Lat, again, it's connected to the cult of Venus and the morning and evening star. And one argument that I make I can't remember which book now, right? I think it's the female divinity book. But in Surah Ar-Rahman, it says, "An-najm wa-shajaru yasjudan," that the star, Venus, and a shajar, whatever tree, lot tree, or whatever tree is on earth, prostrate to God. One, Al-Lat, up in heaven, and Al-Uzza down on earth. Um, they are the cult of Al-Lat and Al-Uzza are connected. And even in the verse, Al-Lat Al-Uzza, they're connected. They're genealogically connected. It goes into Arabian, Canaanitic, Aramaean, Mesopotamian history. It's all the same bunch of traditions interacting with each other. And divine female is the tree, which is obviously it's green and it's producing and it's fertile, and is also Venus. They're connected. Separate from this is a Manat, genealogically distinct. Manat is similar to other, dumb forces of nature. Dumb in the sense like time, fate, death. And she, at some cases, gets associated with the moon. Again, everything has to have some sort of astral component. That's the way the Arabs they symbolize, everything. Everything had to have some sort of celestial symbol. So you've put these things together. They're not historical individuals that were worshipped. There is some argument you can make for other gods about that, but no, they are again the same thing that it's similar to the answer I gave you earlier. It's again looking at the celestial and looking at the terrestrial and extrapolating, anthropomorphizing that you have Al-Lat, I would argue maybe just birth, Al-Uzza, power, life, right? And then Manat, death, the end of things.
Okay, so they weren't historical, but they're anthropomorphized. Okay, yeah. And I want to talk about one more thing, Imran, with regards to chapter 6 of the book. You spoke about a pagan corridor, but I'm glad that I have you with me right now because I wasn't very clear about what time period we were talking about in the book when you referred to that pagan corridor. Is this sometime after 500 or the 7th century? Just prior to the prophet's revelation. So maybe you can just help to clarify that.
Yes. And I actually, if you don't mind, let me look up. I don't want to misspeak because I researched this a whole bunch. Okay. So, I mean, I don't have it right here. I'll say this.
Yeah.
The argument that I make in the book, Queens and Prophets, for what I describe as a pagan corridor, and it is basically that this is in pre-Islamic Arabia, and we are talking about, the Lakhmids or Al-Manadhira. They had a lot of kings called Al-Mundhir, so they pluralize it Al-Manadhira, the Mundhir kingdom, right? So,
Yeah.
and one of the kings there was particularly known for his cruelty and barbarism and conquest. Again, that's how male kings rule in the Near East, is just through brute force. I make the argument that his reign, which really is the sort of early mid-6th century, a little bit less than a century before the rise of the Quran and Muhammad and so on and so forth. This is a time period where paganism sort of makes a comeback. The reason I say this is because we should not think of pre-Islamic Arabia, this late antique period, as only linear. People are worshiping Al-Lat. Then they're worshiping, then they become Jewish. Then they become Christian. Then they become Hanif. Then they become Muslim. No, I think that they're going back and forth. And a lot of that has to do with conquest. It has to do, as a human being in Arabia and really in the ancient Near East, you became the religion of whatever your king was, right? It wasn't like, oh, I'm choosing to convert. That did happen. But overall, people became the religion of whoever their leader was. So with that context in mind, I argue that Al-Mundhir was this force of pagan Al-Uzza worship throughout Arabia, and that he clashed. Of course, the Lakhmids did clash with the Ghassanids in the West, who were proponents of Christianity and the Byzantine, the Roman world, and they clashed not just because of land and because of tribe, but also because of religion. So I tease all that out. I discuss all the details, all the names, all the dates. They're in there. And I describe this pagan corridor as connecting essentially Al-Hira up in the northeast with Aliyat Najd in the middle, which is where the Shaybanids are, the tribe of Shayban, and then Quraysh all the way in the west. This pagan corridor, we have, again, I'm extrapolating from really meager sources, that the worship of Al-Uzza is either it continues or it comes back into fashion. in some cases violently, because of the Lakhmids and the power they exert throughout Arabia in this pagan corridor.
Okay.
And it contrasts with in the south, you have, of course, in Najran and in South Arabia more generally, you have Jews and Christians. They were also fighting, by the way, right? And then in the
Okay.
north, of course, with the Ghassanids, who for a while allied themselves to
Right.
the Christian Ethiopians. So anyway, it's like
Okay.
a sense.
Yeah. Let me just jump in here, Imran, and let me just try to make it a little clear for the sake of our audience. So the Ghassanids were allied with the Byzantine Romans, and they were their vassal state or buffer state. And the Lakhmids were allied with the Persians, and they were their buffer state. Can you tell me what religious background did the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids have around that time period?
Late antique Arabia was very much fractured. It was defined, shaped at every level, social, cultural, religious, by wars between the Persians and the
The
Romans.
Romans. Yeah.
So the East and West. As a result of this warfare, Arabia, to a large extent, especially in the north, was divided into two. In the East, close to the Persians, you had the Lakhmids, and in the West, you had the Ghassanids, allied to the Romans. As a result, it shaped their religious worldview. In the West, the Ghassanids were, to try and simplify, by and large, Monophysite Christians, and so they belonged sort of to the Syriac-speaking churches, and in some cases also Melkite,
Okay.
which is the Church of Rome. Yes.
But correct me if I'm wrong, Imran, but weren't the Byzantine Romans Diophysites, though? I mean,
Yeah.
when
So
they...
that's what I was just saying.
Oh,
Is
okay. Yeah.
you had both varieties in there,
Okay.
and certainly with Al-Harith, one of the famous Christian kings of Ghassan, he is 100% allied to the Romans, to the Byzantines, and he's Diophysite. He's Melkite, right? He belongs to Al-Kanisa al-Malakiyya, Melkaya, right? He belongs to the royal church, which is basically the Byzantine emperor's church.
Yeah.
We do have other varieties, again, the Syriac-speaking churches who are in there, and the Ghassanids play a very important role in actually fashioning the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Monophysite Church.
Okay.
And in the East is actually more complicated. Paganism is much much more powerful in the Lakhmid sphere in Mesopotamia for its historical reasons, and also because the Sasanian Persians had a mistrust of Christianity. So there's scholarship, and Philip Wood and other folks write about Christianity in the East, and so the Church of the East does actually flourish. But that's of course there's a give and take relationship over there. So there is Christianity on both sides, but I would say that's disputed territory, and the
Okay.
variety. Yeah. Okay.
So the Persians at this time, I mean, Christianity was probably gaining traction, but were they also Zoroastrians for the most part, or did that also start to wane at this point?
So again, it's complicated within, if we just talk about the Lakhmids. Are
Okay.
there Zoroastrians? We have an empire of Zoroastrians, right? They're
Okay.
very powerful, and
Yeah.
they shape the Abrahamic traditions profoundly. Within Lachem, I think you have everything, right? You have Zoroastrians, and people even argue for, I'm forgetting now, other religious cults. You have Sabaeans and Mandeans and other religious cults in
Right.
Mesopotamia.
Okay, and let's stick to this, Imran, just for a couple of minutes. So, in my understanding of the Quran, when I read it, it seems that the Quran is also really interested in the geopolitical discussions of its day. Vis-a-vis, for example, in Surah Rum, I think you have a verse that says that the Romans have lost a battle in a land nearby, but then they're going to be successful within a few short years. And then lo and behold, this was in the year 615 CE. And then 9 years later, you have the Battle of Badr around that time, I think, when Heraclius pushed back the Persians. And then if I take Surah Lahab, which essentially is supposed to be about the prophet's uncle, for example, but have you ever considered whether Abu Lahab may have just been a title for the Persian king? Because around this time, the Quran seems very pro-Byzantine and maybe not as much pro-Persian. And so perhaps Abu Lahab is in fact just a name for Khusro, the Persian emperor, because of their Zoroastrian background. So what would be your take on that?
Man, okay, that's a lot. I'm I'll try to answer. I do I do transcribe, translate, and go into depth about Surah Lahab. I talk about Abu Lahab in the next book again, and the female divinity book. But you propose an interesting hypothesis, right? We'll call this the Omar theory again, that Abu Lahab is connected to the Persian monarch. It's possible. I would say so. There's man, two things. One, I do agree with you in what you just said that Abu Lahab, what again, the father of the fire, the possessor
Yeah.
of the fireplace or the fire pit guy, right? Whatever that means,
Yeah.
that this is a sort of a symbolic name. It's a type for maybe it has echoes in different historical characters. So I agree with that.
Right.
You may propose a name, I may propose a name, someone else may propose. People have proposed things that this is someone in the Hebrew Bible, etc. That's I do agree that's right. We don't know who it is, so you may be right, you may be wrong. Not sure. Second thing I was going to say about Abu Lahab is in the female divinity book, I do argue that this episode, this surah, is it 10, 103, 106? I'm forgetting now what number it is, but that this surah is rehearsing a kind of condemnation of the Hebrew Bible priestess. And that again, it's so multi-layered. So this is it's not just retelling something that happened in the Hebrew Bible over 1,000 years earlier. It has to do with current events, like you're describing. It has to do with the Persians, the Romans, and
Right.
Arabia, what's going on.
Yeah.
So I mean, so I think that one I mentioned it in the book because it has to do with the condemnation of the priestess, and it affects the agency of women in Arabia. And I guess I'll stop there. I don't want to get into more,
Yeah.
current
Yeah,
concepts.
no worries. And thank you for sharing those thoughts. Yeah. Because, I had to try and figure out obscure uncle or the Persian emperor. So I respect what you've written in the book about Abu Lahab and everything, but it just seems that the Quran is a lot more clever than we give it credit for. And if it can make a comment about the Byzantine Romans, then why not the other big superpower on the block, right? But let me come
Yes, I'm
back.
sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry,
please.
just to add, I agree with what you're saying. In again in the female divinity book, it's you're looking at I forget his name. I mean, the uncle and his wife Arwa. They're actually
Yeah.
they're actually they're actually presented quite positively.
Hmm.
They're a good-looking couple, and he
Mm.
has a good relationship with them. All of a sudden, things sour. So that's just to support what you're saying. That it can't all of a sudden. Why is this guy Abu Lahab? It sounds weird. Or why is it the guy with a red face? Who's coming up with this stuff? Yeah, never mind.
Indeed. And speaking of depicting people in positive lights and negative lights, and Abu Lahab and some of the other characters from the Prophet's milieu, I want to touch upon another female character that's also mentioned in the book, but perhaps it would be interesting for our audience to know a bit more about her. Hind bint Utbah, aka the wife of Abu Sufyan, the arch nemesis of the Prophet Muhammad. What can you tell us about her and her evolution from being an arch nemesis to being a quote unquote good Muslim woman somewhere down the line?
Wow, Hind bint Utbah deserves her own book. Again, there are studies about her, but she deserves the kind of treatment that I think I've given the earlier three great women that we've talked about. According to the Islamic narrative, the literary sources which come afterwards, Hind bint Utbah is the wife of Abu Sufyan. And she's a noblewoman. She's the daughter of Utbah, right? And these are the sort of building blocks of the Umayyad Empire later on. Staunch pagans in the sources, vociferous enemies of Muhammad and Hamza and all the stories that we know. And I'll say two things about her. One, the story is that she's a staunch pagan, and then with time she sort of converts to Islam begrudgingly when Muhammad conquers Mecca, which he does. Of course, it's a bloodless conquest. He comes with this, I'm taking over, and everyone sort of surrenders. Um, but that with time she actually starts. She's a warrior. She's a she's depicted as a bloodthirsty warrior who, having killed Hamza and then, sort of assassinates him and then bites into his, cuts him up and
Mm,
bites into his liver.
right.
That she takes all that bloodthirsty energy and then she starts fighting for Islam later on up in, the northern sphere. And then she sort of retires and then, becomes a good. It's anything is possible. Anything is possible. Is that
Mm,
possible? It is. Um, uh, but what I want to say earlier than that is that I argue in the third book, which is not yet out, that she is part of, again, this class of priestesses.
mhm,
A priestess is not one thing. Usually it's the ruling woman, the chieftain or the queen. She's the chief priestess.
right.
She plays that role. And with the what I call Arabia's battle song, there's a famous song, where she sings on the battlefield, نحن بنات طارق, what is it? سيوفنا صواعق ونجوم. It's like a beautiful
Mm,
battle song.
mhm,
She is that type. I'll mention one last thing. That Nadia Al-Sheikh has a great book on women in Abbasid Arabia or the Abbasid world, and she uses Hind bint Utbah as the
mm,
archetypical pre-Islamic woman, and she's
mhm.
right.
Okay, so just to stay with Hind and contrasting her with Zenobia, whom we see goes from being a heroine to being vilified in the Islamic tradition, whereas Hind goes in the opposite direction. So is this deliberately thematic that the only good woman is the Muslim woman, etc.? So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're onto something, and I think that there's some truth to that.
Mm,
There's women who ruled before Islam, they're no good, or that women who ruled outside the Islamic sphere, they're sort of no good. But you have this really sort of bloodthirsty, powerful woman who converted to Islam. Oh, well, look at her, she's become a saint.
mm,
That also happens, by the way. People might get upset with me. You have the figure of Aisha, right? Aisha
mm,
bint Abi Bakr,
yeah.
another very important figure in Islamic history,
Mm,
who really is sort of this jealous wife and who's sort of has rebellious tendencies. And I, in the third book, again, go a little bit further. People may get a little bit uncomfortable, but she becomes, and again, after the passing of her husband, Muhammad the Prophet, she gets into a civil war with Ali. And I mean, it's like these people, hey, what's going on here?
mm,
She seems pretty harsh, but she's rehabilitated
mhm,
through the Islamic sources as a narrator of hadith. So she becomes a muhadditha rather than someone who is, marching in a civil war and a jealous wife and a rebel. She is a muhadditha. Her image is rehabilitated. And Nadia al-Sheikh and other
mm.
scholars, women scholars, write about this, and they're right. And I think you're right as well.
Okay, yeah, of course, and we'll definitely check out that book at some point. I want to go back to the tripartite formula, Imran, for a bit, and ask you a tangential question. So, as I understand it from our previous discussions, that the name Allah was the name that North Arabians used to refer to the supreme deity, and Rahman was the name of the supreme deity for South Arabians, and at some point the two got unified. And perhaps it was Surah Rahman where it says that call upon Allah or Rahman, it doesn't matter. These are all beautiful names. What happened to the third name in the tripartite formula, Ar-Rahim? Do we have any attestation in the epigraphical or archaeological record that says that this was also a separate deity? So tell us about that.
Yeah, it's more complicated. I mean, everything is complicated, but to simplify and then say that others have more knowledge than me is what I'll do.
Mhm.
Um, You said Allah is the God in the north, Rahman is God in the south, Rahmanan, right? In Himyaritic or Sabaic, fine. Where is Ar-Rahim coming from? I would argue the following, that the Basmala, and again, there is actually at least one or two instances of a pre-Islamic Basmala, that is the invocation of God, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, something like that, right? That's the sort of Muslim translation of it today. But what I argue, obviously, is that two things are happening. One is that it's the unification of Arabia, north and south, but that it's also tripartite. So you're unifying Arabia in this bipartite way, but then the tripartite formula adds Ar-Rahim. Do we have evidence for Ar-Rahim being venerated? Yes, a little bit in the north, I think in Palmyra, but there
Mm,
is no major deity called Ar-Rahim.
mhm,
And even I think again Ahmad al-Jallad redoes he rereads the pre-Islamic Basmala and he qualifies again that it's not necessarily it's not invoking, the names of one or two gods. Some of them are actually just attributes.
Mm.
I'm mangling it now in what I'm saying, but folks will have to read what I'm talking about. What I mean to say here is that Ar-Rahim is an attribute, a minor deity. It doesn't really matter. I mean, the ancient Arabians found attributes and worshiped them or venerated them. So they were not always really, they're not as paganistic as we think, right? They did sort of believe in a sort of a divine over, a creator God, and then there's sort of these attributes. Ar-Rahim was not a high God, and I think that that name or that attribute was included in this tripartite formula because those are the rules of the game. This is how you access the divine. In what doesn't matter how you see the universe, it has to be tripartite.
Mhm. Okay, indeed. Let's go off on another bit of a tangent, Imran, and this is with regards to a queen that you've mentioned in the book in passing, Queen Cleopatra. And of course, I remember that a couple of years back, there was a lot of controversy with regards to her ethnic background. She's obviously a descendant of the Greek Ptolemaic, family. And would you like to make a comment about what kind of background she may have come from by the time we get from Ptolemy to the time of Jesus, 30 years prior to which she had passed away?
It's not really my area. I'll just say that I rely on the expertise of others,
Mhm.
and what you just said. I agree with. I have nothing really to add.
Okay. All right. Okay. So we'll skip over this then. So I'll say that at this point in time, I've pretty much exhausted all of my questions for the show, Imran, but I do have a surprise guest question for you, which is something that all of our guests tend to look forward to. And I regret to say I've only got one, so after which I promise to let you go. And so the surprise guest question comes from your very good friend, Professor Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds, who wrote Christianity and the Quran, and we just did an episode with him. And his question to you is, Dear Imran, your excellent book, Queens and Prophets, forms a bridge between the worlds of late antique Arabia and early Islam. Some scholars argue that the Quran may privilege men over women, but at least it takes one step beyond Jahiliyyah society, which oppressed women severely. How does your research affect this argument?
Well, thanks to you and thanks to Gabriel for asking a very. He has a way of really making complex things simple, which is really a mark of a strong educator. Um, okay, so I get this question a lot. Um, you know, Dr. Al-Badawi, you've published these books. What does that mean for the status of women in Arabia? And what did Islam do to the status of women? Because the argument, again, in sort of our nonchalant, everyday, pious believing is that Islam raised the status of women and made it better. Now, that's true in many cases, but then there's in other cases it's also true that women, there's no woman khalifa, women can't rule, women can't do certain things, which in my mind there's there's not a biological argument for it, for example, right? There's things that women can't do clearly. There are things that men can't do clearly, but there are some things that women have been prevented from doing, and Islam and the Quran sort of just contribute to that patriarchal world. Let me back up for a second and say this. Two things. One, um, women in pre-Islamic Arabia, they did rule, they owned property, they dispensed with property, they, in some cases, had multiple male partners. They were represented in the mythology, the art, and the architecture. This is all before Islam, right? So,
Mhm.
and then Islam comes, and if we focus now especially on the Quran, it regulates the relationships
Mhm.
between men and women, and it limits, I would say, the autonomy of women when it comes to certain areas of public life, in the same way that Christianity and Judaism does. I mean, that's Islam really is the final edition, and it raises the status of it improves the status of women by protecting them in the Quran again with looking at Surah An-Nisa. They're guaranteed a certain portion of inheritance, etc., etc.
Mhm. So,
So it's kind of a nuanced answer. I will say that we have evidence for powerful women who did lots of amazing things. On the other hand, the late antique Arabian sphere was so marked by warfare, civil warfare, and the kind of warfare that is ripple effects from the Romans and the Persians. And you also have Hurub al-Fijar, which is the wars of apostasy, and the tradition of Ayyam al-Arab, where just lots and lots of war stories. that Arabia started to become more and more violent and unstable because of just, men conquering for land and, with one another for tribal reasons. That depleted and diminished the status of women on the eve of Islam. So it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
Women had good status, but
Hmm.
they were getting cut down because men were fighting war.
Right.
And so by the time the Quran came, it's guaranteeing them a share in this very, very patriarchal world. So it does a very good job of in this under a patriarchal umbrella of giving women a share. And if we're able to sort of walk and chew gum and study pre-Islamic Arabia, you can see that there are parts where women could do things and women couldn't do things, uh, prior to the Quran. I know it's a
Okay.
convoluted answer, but
No,
it's a little bit.
not at all. We'll take it as it is. So maybe analogous to two steps forward, one step back, or somewhere thereabouts. Yeah, I agree with you on that completely. And so finally, Imran, let me end our episode by asking you that, you've done a tremendous job in giving a voice to the voiceless women and the forgotten women of pre-Islamic Arabia. If the women in your book could have had agency over their own life and told their own stories, how do you reckon they would want to be remembered by history?
One is I would say I'm not qualified to answer because I'm not a woman, but honestly, I waited so long for someone else to write this book. I waited so long for any woman or man to just write, to connect the dots in this way. It never happened. So then I just did it. Um, I think, in the case, I'll try to be precise. In the case of someone like Zenobia, she would have explained why she challenged Rome. In the case of, Mavia, maybe she would explain why she accepted or even tolerated Christianity and that she spread it among the Arab peoples. And Khadijah would have explained why she converted to Islam and believed in her husband in that way.
Mhm.
That's all I can say. I would shudder to say more than that.
Okay, and I think that's really well said. And on that note, so let me just conclude by saying that for our viewers and listeners who have been with us all this time, thank you very much for staying till the end. Please be sure to get Professor Dr. Emran El-Badawi's book, the first of a planned trilogy. The book, once again, is Queens and Prophets: How Arabian Noblewomen and Holy Men Shaped Paganism, Christianity, and Islam. Emran El-Badawi, thank you so much for your time, sir. You've been a wonderful guest. I always enjoy talking to you, and this is a tremendous book. I really hope that everybody goes out there and gets it. And we of course need to have you back for your other book, Female Divinity in the Quran. And inshallah, we wish you Godspeed in getting your third book completed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.